The crimson recording light beneath the stack of shipping invoices pulses like a heartbeat against my trembling fingers, each flash a countdown to either my salvation or my destruction. And as I watch Konstantin Volkov's elegant hand glide across yet another document that I know contains the coded language of death and violence, I can't help but marvel at how something so beautiful can be so utterly damning. 3 years I've sat in this chair. 3 years of watching him orchestrate what I believe to be legitimate business dealings from behind his massive mahogany desk. 3 years of filing away papers that I now know document human trafficking routes, money laundering schemes, and execution orders disguised as inventory transfers. And tonight, God help me, tonight I finally have enough evidence recorded on this tiny device to bring down the entire Volkov crime family and send the man I've secretly loved to prison for the rest of his life. The irony isn't lost on me that the very man who taught me to appreciate fine literature during our late-night sessions reviewing contracts is now the subject of my own personal betrayal narrative, complete with all the tragic elements of a Shakespearean downfall. Except this isn't fiction, and the blood that will be spilled won't wash off the stage when the curtain falls. I've memorized every detail of his office over these endless months, the way the amber light from his antique desk lamp casts shadows across his sharp cheekbones, how his platinum cufflinks catch the glow from the fireplace when he reaches for his crystal tumbler of vodka, the soft leather scent that permeates everything he touches, from his chair to the jacket he sometimes drapes over my shoulders when the air conditioning runs too cold, and most dangerously of all, the way his ice blue eyes seem to see straight through my professional facade to the woman underneath who has been slowly, inexorably, falling for a man she knows she should fear. My heart hammers against my ribs as I pretend to organize the quarterly reports, while actually positioning my phone to capture every damning word of his conversation with Victor, his lieutenant, whose scarred face tells stories of violence that my suburban upbringing never prepared me to understand, and I force myself to breathe steadily as they discuss the shipment from Montenegro that I now know refers to 12 young women who will disappear into the dark underbelly of human trafficking if I don't get this evidence to Agent Martinez by midnight. The weight of their lives presses down on my shoulders like a physical force, making my silk blouse stick to my skin despite the climate-controlled environment, and I have to bite my lower lip to keep from shaking as Konstantin's deep voice, tinged with that slight Russian accent that used to send shivers of attraction down my spine, now sends shivers of terror, as he calmly discusses their disposal, as if they were nothing more than inventory to be managed. The containers will arrive at Pier 7 tomorrow at dawn, he murmurs to Victor, his long fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that I've learned signals his impatience, and I realize with growing horror that dawn is less than 8 hours away, which means if I don't act tonight, those women will vanish forever into a nightmare that I helped facilitate by maintaining the very files that make this operation possible. The recording device feels like it's burning through my purse as I catalog every word, every name, every location that spills from his lips like poisoned honey. And I wonder if he can sense the betrayal radiating from my skin like heat. If somehow the man who notices when I've changed my nail polish or worn a different perfume can detect the fundamental shift in my loyalty that occurred 3 weeks ago when I accidentally walked in on him, torturing information out of a rival gang member in the basement of this very building. That moment, seeing him covered in another man's blood, his usually pristine white shirt splattered with evidence of his capacity for violence, his face completely emotionless as he wiped his hands clean with a monogrammed towel, shattered every romantic delusion I'd harbored about the true nature of Konstantin Volkov. And yet somehow, impossibly, it also intensified my attraction to him in ways that make me question my own moral compass and wonder if 3 years in his orbit have corrupted me more thoroughly than I care to admit. The duality of my feelings creates a constant war in my chest. Love and revulsion battling for dominance while I smile and take dictation and pretend that I haven't seen behind the curtain of his carefully constructed legitimate businessman persona to witness the monster that lurks beneath his $1,000 suits and old-world charm. As Victor leaves with his marching orders, Konstantin leans back in his chair and fixes me with a stare that makes my blood freeze in my veins. Those pale blue eyes that I once compared to Arctic ice now reminding me more of a predator calculating whether I'm prey worth pursuing. And the silence that stretches between us feels heavy with unspoken accusations and dangerous possibilities. I force myself to continue typing, to maintain the illusion of normalcy, even as every instinct screams at me to run, to grab my purse with its hidden recording device and sprint for the elevator before he can piece together what I've been doing. But my legs feel like lead, and my fingers shake so violently that I have to clutch the edge of my desk to steady myself. Serafina, he says finally, my name rolling off his tongue like a caress that feels more like a threat. And the way he pronouns each syllable with deliberate precision makes me think of a cat playing with a mouse before delivering the killing blow. We need to talk. The words hang in the air between us like a death sentence, and I realize with crystal clarity that somehow, despite all my careful planning and meticulous attention to detail, my cover has been blown, and the man I've been secretly recording for the FBI knows exactly what I've been doing. My mouth goes dry as sandpaper as I watch his hand move with deliberate slowness toward the bottom drawer of his desk. The drawer that I know contains a Glock 19 with a silencer, because I'm the one who ordered the custom leather holster for it last Christmas, back when I thought it was just a wealthy businessman's paranoid security precaution, rather than the tool of a cold-blooded killer who wouldn't hesitate to use it on someone who betrayed his trust. The weight of my deception settles around my shoulders like a shroud as I realize that all those late nights when he trusted me with sensitive information, all those moments when he let his guard down and treated me like a confidant rather than an employee, all those almost kisses in empty elevators and lingering touches when he helped me with my coat, all of it was real for him, while I was systematically destroying his life one recorded conversation at a time. The irony burns in my throat like acid as I understand that in trying to save those faceless victims of his crimes, I've become the ultimate victim myself. Not of his violence, but of the impossible situation where doing the right thing means betraying the only man who has ever made me feel truly alive, even if that aliveness came wrapped in moral compromise and dangerous attraction to someone whose hands are stained with more blood than I can begin to calculate. My phone continues recording beneath the invoices, capturing what might be my last moments as a free woman. And I wonder if Agent Martinez will ever hear this final conversation, or if Constantine will ensure that both my device and my body disappear into the same dark void that swallows all evidence of his crimes. I've been watching you, little dove, he continues, using the pet name that always made my heart skip, but now sounds like an epitaph. And the small smile that plays at the corners of his mouth is equal parts beautiful and terrifying, like watching a work of art that depicts something fundamentally evil. His hand pauses on the drawer handle, and in that suspended moment before everything changes forever, I see something flicker across his features. Not anger or betrayal, but something that looks almost like disappointment, as if he had hoped against hope that his instincts about me were wrong. The recording light continues to pulse beneath the papers, a tiny beacon of hope in what feels like my final moments of freedom, and I realize that regardless of what happens next, I've already crossed a line from which there is no return. I am no longer Serafina Chen, naive secretary who got in over her head, but rather a federal informant who has just been caught red-handed by one of the most dangerous men in the city, a man whose capacity for both tenderness and violence I've witnessed firsthand, and whose reaction to my betrayal will determine whether I live to see tomorrow's dawn or become another cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of organized crime. The 12 hours that follow feel like a lifetime compressed into a nightmare of fluorescent lights, endless questions, and the constant weight of knowing that somewhere across the city, Konstantin Volkov is probably planning my death with the same methodical precision he uses to organize his shipping manifests. And as I sit in this sterile FBI safe house surrounded by agents whose names I'm not allowed to know, I can't stop replaying that final moment in his office when his hand froze on the drawer handle, and something that looked almost like regret flickered across his Arctic features before he simply said, "Go home, Serafina. We'll finish this conversation tomorrow," as if he were granting me a stay of execution rather than dismissing an employee for the evening. Agent Martinez, a compact woman with steel gray hair and eyes that have seen too much, spreads photographs across the scratched metal table between us like she's dealing cards in a game where my life is the ante. And each image makes my stomach turn with fresh horror as I realize the true scope of what I've been unknowingly complicit in for 3 years of filing, organizing, and scheduling what I believed were legitimate business transactions. The first photograph shows a young woman who couldn't be more than 19, her dark eyes vacant and hollow in a way that speaks of unspeakable trauma. And Martinez's voice carries the weight of professional detachment when she explains that this girl was found in a shipping container at the very pier Constantine mentioned last night, except she was found 3 weeks too late to save her sanity, if not her life. Marina Petrov, age 18, disappeared from a bus station in Bucharest 6 months ago, Martinez continues, her fingers tapping against each photograph as she builds her case with the systematic precision of someone who has spent decades documenting human misery. And I realize with growing horror that the shipping manifests I typed so carefully, the ones with innocent-sounding cargo descriptions like textile imports and agricultural equipment, were actually detailed inventories of human souls being bought and sold like livestock across international borders. The next photograph shows a girl even younger, her blonde hair matted and her arms covered in needle tracks that tell a story of forced addiction designed to ensure compliance. And when Martinez explains that this child was rescued from a brothel that operates under the protection of the Volkov organization, I have to press my hand against my mouth to keep from vomiting as I remember typing the address of that very establishment into Constantine's appointment calendar just last month. The weight of my unwitting participation in these atrocities crushes down on me like a physical force as Martinez continues her grim presentation, each photograph a testament to the evil that I helped facilitate through my efficient organization of files and my careful maintenance of schedules that I now understand were actually trafficking timelines designed to coordinate the movement of human cargo across state and international lines. My hands shake as I recognize locations from shipping documents I prepared, addresses that seemed innocuous when I was scheduling Constantine's meetings, but now reveal themselves as nodes in a vast network of suffering that spans from Eastern Europe to the darkest corners of American cities. And the realization that my professional competence directly contributed to the destruction of innocent lives makes me feel complicit in ways that no amount of cooperation with the FBI can ever truly absolve. The pattern became clear once we started connecting your recordings to our existing surveillance data, Martinez explains, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who delivers terrible news for a living. And she shows me transcripts of conversations I recorded that have been cross-referenced with financial records, shipping logs, and missing persons reports from 12 different countries, creating a tapestry of organized crime that reaches into levels of government and law enforcement that make my naive belief in justice feel like a children's fairy tale. The scope of the Volkov organization's reach becomes clear as she explains how my simple act of recording conversations in Constantine's office has provided the missing pieces to a puzzle that federal investigators have been trying to solve for over a decade, connecting dots that span from corrupt port authorities to bought politicians to judges who ensure that Volkov family members never see the inside of a courtroom. But even as I try to process the magnitude of what my recordings have revealed, I can't stop thinking about the man behind these crimes, the Constantine who brought me soup when I was sick with the flu last winter, who remembered my birthday when my own family forgot, who looked genuinely concerned when I mentioned my mother's cancer diagnosis, and quietly arranged for her to see the best oncologist in the city, without ever acknowledging that he had intervened on her behalf. The cognitive dissonance between the monster Martinez is describing and the man who once spent 3 hours helping me understand complex legal terminology because he noticed I was struggling with a contract review creates a fracture in my understanding of reality that makes me question whether anything I believed about him was real or just another layer of manipulation in a game I never understood I was playing. The trafficking operation generates approximately $50 million annually, Martinez continues, her words hammering against my consciousness like physical blows. and she explains how the money flows through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that I helped maintain by organizing financial documents and scheduling meetings with accountants, who I now realize were actually money laundering specialists, disguised as legitimate business consultants. Each revelation adds another weight to the crushing guilt that sits on my chest like a stone, and I find myself wondering if the late nights Constantine and I spent reviewing contracts were actually him testing my loyalty or my ignorance, determining whether I could be trusted with increasingly sensitive information or whether I would eventually become a liability that needed to be eliminated. The safe house itself feels like a prison disguised as protection, with its bulletproof windows that never open, its anonymous furniture that looks like it came from a budget hotel, and its constant background hum of electronic surveillance equipment that reminds me every moment that my life now exists at the intersection of federal investigation and organized crime retaliation, where the people protecting me are the same people who will ultimately ask me to testify against a man whose capacity for violence I've witnessed firsthand, but whose capacity for tenderness I've experienced in moments that felt more real than anything else in my carefully ordered existence. The agents assigned to my protection move through the space with the hypervigilant efficiency of people who understand that death can arrive through any window or doorway, and their presence serves as a constant reminder that somewhere in the city, Constantine's people are already hunting for me with resources and determination that far exceed anything the FBI can marshal for my defense. As night falls outside the reinforced windows, I find myself thinking about the last normal moment of my old life, when I sat at my desk yesterday morning, organizing Constantine's schedule for the week, and actually worried about whether he would prefer his coffee meeting moved to accommodate his personal trainer, back when my biggest concern was maintaining the illusion of professional competence, while secretly harboring romantic feelings for a man I believed was simply a successful businessman with some rough edges and a mysterious past. The innocence of that version of myself feels like something that belonged to another person entirely, someone who believed in clear moral lines and happy endings, and the possibility that love could triumph over circumstances, rather than the woman I am now, who understands that sometimes love and betrayal are not opposites, but rather two sides of the same devastating coin. The photographs spread across the table blur as exhaustion and emotional overload finally catch up with me, but Martinez's voice cuts through my mental fog with new information that makes my blood turn to ice in my veins. We've intercepted communications indicating that Volkov's organization has already eliminated 2 potential witnesses who might have corroborated your testimony, she says with the clinical detachment of someone delivering a weather report rather than news of multiple murders. And she explains that both victims were found within hours of my extraction from Constantine's office, suggesting a level of operational efficiency that indicates either supernatural prescience or inside information about FBI activities. The implication hangs in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Someone within the federal investigation has been feeding information to the Volkov organization, which means that my location, my identity as an informant, and my potential testimony are all compromised in ways that make this safe house feel less like protection and more like a trap waiting to spring. My mind races through the possibilities, as Martinez explains that they're moving me to a new location within the hour. But even as she speaks about upgraded security protocols and additional protective measures, I can see something in her eyes that looks suspiciously like the expression of someone who knows she's fighting a battle she's already lost. The sound of engines outside makes my heart stop completely, a low rumble that grows closer and more menacing with each passing second. And through the bulletproof glass, I can see the silhouettes of vehicles that don't belong to the FBI surveillance team that Martinez assured me was maintaining a perimeter around the building. The lights cut out suddenly, plunging us into darkness that feels absolute and final. And in that moment, before the backup generators kick in, I hear Martinez whisper a single word that confirms my worst fears. Shit. When the emergency lighting flickers to life, casting everything in hellish red shadows, I realize that the protection I thought I had gained by betraying Constantine was always an illusion, and that his reach extends far beyond anything the federal government can contain or control, which means that the choice I thought I had made between justice and survival was actually no choice at all, but rather the first move in a game where the rules were written in blood, long before I ever entered his office, and the outcome was predetermined by forces I never understood, and powers I never knew existed until this moment when they've come to collect what they believe I owe them. The emergency lighting bathes everything in crimson shadows that make the safe house feel like the inside of a beating heart. And as Martinez barks orders into her radio while drawing her service weapon, I realize with crystalline clarity that all the federal protection in the world means nothing when you're dealing with a man who has spent his entire life turning impossible situations to his advantage through a combination of strategic brilliance and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that views human lives as chess pieces to be sacrificed in service of a larger game. The sound of boots on gravel outside grows closer with each passing second, accompanied by the low murmur of voices speaking in what I recognize as Russian, and through the reinforced windows I can make out the silhouettes of at least 6 men moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit as they establish positions around the building with the casual efficiency of people who have done this many times before. Martinez's backup team responds with admirable speed, but even as they take defensive positions throughout the safe house, I can see in their faces the same expression I've learned to recognize in Constantine's business rivals, the look of people who understand they're outmatched by an opponent who plays by different rules and operates with resources that exceed their own by orders of magnitude, and the realization that my federal protection is about to prove woefully inadequate fills me with a terror so profound that it transcends mere fear and becomes something closer to existential dread. The tactical radio chatter creates a constant background of tension as agents call for reinforcements that I suspect will arrive too late to matter. And through it all, I find myself thinking about the way Constantine's eyes looked when he told me to go home last night. How there was something almost like regret mixed with what I now recognize was disappointment rather than surprise, as if he had been hoping against hope that his suspicions about my activities were wrong, but had already prepared for the possibility that they were not. The first gunshot shatters the night like thunder, followed immediately by a cascade of automatic weapons fire that turns the safe house windows into spider webs of fractured bulletproof glass, and as Martinez shoves me behind an overturned table that provides the illusion of cover rather than actual protection, I realize that this is not the calculated violence of a criminal organization trying to eliminate a witness, but rather something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. This is the methodical destruction of every barrier between Konstantin Volkov and the woman who betrayed his trust, carried out with the kind of overwhelming force that suggests he views my federal protection not as an obstacle to overcome, but as an insult to be obliterated. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouted commands, I hear something that makes my blood freeze in my veins. The distinctive sound of Konstantin's voice cutting through the din with the calm authority of someone who commands absolute loyalty from men who would die at his word. And when his words reach me across the battlefield that this safe house has become, they carry the weight of inevitability that comes with knowing that every exit has been sealed and every escape route has been anticipated by someone who understands the federal playbook better than the agents who wrote it. "You have 10 seconds to send her out," he calls, his Russian accent more pronounced than usual in a way that tells me his careful control is beginning to slip, "or my men will come in and collect what belongs to me." The possessive pronoun hits me like a physical blow as I realize that somewhere in the twisted landscape of his criminal mind, Konstantin has decided that my 3 years of service have created a bond that transcends mere employment and enters territory that feels dangerously close to ownership. And the implications of that shift in his thinking make my hands shake with something that goes beyond fear and approaches pure terror. Martinez meets my eyes across our improvised barricade, and I can see her calculating odds that don't favor our survival. But before either of us can speak, the gunfire stops with an abruptness that feels more ominous than the violence itself, leaving only the ringing in our ears and the acrid smell of gunpowder that drifts through the shattered windows like the smoke of burned bridges. Serafina. Constantine's voice carries through the sudden silence with the intimate familiarity of someone calling a lover's name, and the way he draws out each syllable makes me think of all the times he said my name in his office during those late nights when the rest of the building was empty, and the space between us felt charged with possibilities that I was too afraid to explore. Except now that same intimacy feels like a threat wrapped in velvet and delivered with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "I know you can hear me, little dove," he continues, using the pet name that once made my heart flutter, but now sounds like an epitaph being carved into granite. And I realize with growing horror that he's not just here to eliminate a federal witness, but to reclaim something that he believes was stolen from him by people who never understood its true value. Martinez gestures frantically for me to stay down as she coordinates with her remaining agents through hand signals that speak to training scenarios they probably never expected to use in an actual urban warfare situation. But even as they prepare for what appears to be a final defensive stand, I can hear the sound of vehicles arriving outside. Not FBI reinforcements, but additional Volkov soldiers, whose presence suggests that Constantine has committed resources to this operation that far exceed what would be necessary for a simple elimination. As if he's not just trying to silence a witness, but making a statement about the consequences of betraying his trust that will resonate throughout both the criminal and law enforcement communities. The tactical situation deteriorates with each passing moment as Martinez receives updates through her earpiece that paint a picture of federal forces being systematically outmaneuvered and outgunned by an opponent who seems to have anticipated every move in their defensive playbook. And I realize with dawning comprehension that Constantine's reputation for strategic thinking extends far beyond the business world into military-style operations that suggest either extensive training or access to personnel, with backgrounds that make them more than capable of neutralizing federal protection. Details. The safe house that was supposed to be my sanctuary has become my tomb, and the man I helped build a case against is now demonstrating exactly why the FBI has been unable to touch him for over a decade. Not because they lack evidence, but because he operates on a level that transcends their understanding of how criminal organizations function in the modern world. "I'm coming in now," Constantine announces, with the calm certainty of someone stating an established fact, rather than declaring an intention. And through the broken windows I can see his silhouette moving across the courtyard with the unhurried confidence of a man who knows that all resistance has been neutralized and all escape routes have been sealed, making his approach feel less like an assault and more like a king returning to claim his rightful property. The federal agents around me shift their positions with the desperate efficiency of people making their last stand. But even their professional training cannot hide the fact that they're facing an opponent whose resources and tactical sophistication far exceed anything they were prepared to handle, and their growing desperation fills the air like the smell of fear sweat and spent ammunition. As Constantine's footsteps echo through the main entrance with the measured cadence of someone who has all the time in the world, I find myself remembering the way he moved through his office during our late-night work sessions, how he carried himself with the unconscious grace of someone who had never doubted his right to occupy any space he entered. And now that same confidence feels predatory in ways that make me understand that the man I thought I knew was always a carefully constructed facade, designed to hide something far more dangerous and infinitely more complex than a simple businessman with criminal connections. The sound of his approach grows closer with each heartbeat, accompanied by the whispered prayers of federal agents who probably never expected their careers to end in a firefight against someone who treats government authority as nothing more than an inconvenience to be brushed aside through superior firepower and tactical planning. When he finally appears in the doorway of our makeshift fortress, backlit by the emergency lighting in a way that makes him look like an avenging angel carved from shadow and gun smoke, I feel the last vestiges of my old life crumble away like sand through my fingers, because the man standing before me bears only a passing resemblance to the Constantine I thought I knew. This version has blood on his hands that I can see even in the dim lighting. His usually perfect hair is disheveled from combat, and his ice-blue eyes burn with something that goes beyond anger into territory that feels biblical in its intensity. The expensive suit that always made him look like he belonged in boardrooms and symphony halls is now torn and stained with evidence of the violence he's used to reach me, but somehow this damaged version of him is more compelling than the polished businessman who used to make my pulse race with stolen glances across conference tables and accidentally lingering touches when he handed me documents. "Hello, Serafina," he says with the same tone he used to greet me every morning for 3 years, as if we're meeting in his office for another day of routine business rather than standing in the ruins of a federal safe house surrounded by the bodies of agents who died trying to protect me from him. And the casual normalcy of his greeting makes the surreal nature of this moment feel even more nightmarish than the violence that preceded it. His gaze moves over me with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory, checking for damage to something that belongs to him. And I realize with a chill that runs deeper than fear that whatever happens next will be determined not by federal law or criminal justice, but by the twisted logic of a man who views my betrayal as a breach of contract that requires personal resolution. "You look tired, little dove," he observes, with what sounds almost like genuine concern, and the disconnect between his solicitous tone and the carnage surrounding us creates a cognitive dissonance that makes me question whether I've lost my grip on reality entirely, or whether this is simply what it looks like when someone with Constantine's particular brand of sociopathy decides to collect what he believes is rightfully his, regardless of the obstacles placed in his way. Martinez raises her weapon with the shaking hands of someone making a final desperate gesture, but Constantine's attention never wavers from my face as he continues his approach with the patient inevitability of a man who knows that all resistance is ultimately futile when faced with someone who possesses unlimited resources and an absolute certainty about the righteousness of his cause. The moment stretches between us like a bridge over an abyss, and I realize that everything that happens from this point forward will depend on words not yet spoken, choices not yet made, and truths not yet revealed, because despite the violence and chaos that brought us to this moment, there's something in Constantine's eyes that suggests this confrontation is about far more than eliminating a federal witness. It's about settling a debt that goes beyond money or information or even betrayal, into territory that touches on questions of loyalty, possession, and the kind of twisted love that can only exist between people who have seen each other's true faces and chosen to look away until circumstances make such willful blindness impossible to maintain. The moment Constantine's lips part to speak, everything I thought I knew about the past 3 years shatters like crystal hitting concrete, because the words that emerge from his mouth carry the weight of revelations so profound and devastating that they restructure my entire understanding of reality. Beginning with his confession that the shipping manifests I believed documented human trafficking routes were actually detailed rescue operations designed to extract women and children from the very networks that his father's organization had spent decades building into a multinational empire of suffering and exploitation. Every container you helped me track, every route you organized, every timeline you coordinated, he says, with the exhausted cadence of someone carrying secrets that have been eating him alive from the inside, was another group of victims being moved to safe houses and new identities, away from the monsters who bought and sold them like livestock. The blood on his hands takes on new meaning as he explains how he spent the last 5 years systematically dismantling his father's trafficking operation from within, using his position as heir apparent to redirect shipments, corrupt manifests, and funnel millions of dollars in blood money toward underground railroads that span from Eastern Europe to safe havens across North and South America. And I realize with growing amazement that every late night I spent helping him with inventory management was actually time spent coordinating one of the largest rescue operations in modern history. The weapons deals that I recorded with such careful attention to incriminating detail were actually Martinez's own federal task force being supplied with untraceable firearms and ammunition needed for extraction operations in countries where local law enforcement had been bought and paid for by the very organizations Constantine was fighting against, creating a shadow war that existed entirely outside the official channels that had proven themselves compromised at every level. The manifests you copied so diligently for your FBI handlers, he continues, his ice-blue eyes never leaving mine as he speaks with the measured precision of someone who has rehearsed this confession in his mind countless times. Those were actually coded communications with safe house operators and extraction teams, which means that every recording you made, every document you photographed, every meeting you reported was feeding information about active rescue operations directly to the people we were trying to rescue those victims from. The implications hit me like physical blows as I realized that my 3 months of undercover work for the FBI wasn't exposing criminal activity, but sabotaging humanitarian operations, and that my moral certainty about fighting the good fight was actually making me complicit in perpetuating the very horrors I thought I was helping to stop. Agent Martinez, bleeding from a shoulder wound that stains her tactical vest dark crimson, struggles to maintain her weapon's aim as Constantine reveals the depth of federal corruption that extends from street-level agents all the way to deputy directors who have been taking Volkov family money for over a decade, not to protect criminal operations but to ensure that legitimate law enforcement efforts never interfere with the shadow rescue network that operates parallel to, and often in direct contradiction to, official federal policy. Your handler Martinez here has been feeding information about our operations to human trafficking rings for 18 months, he explains, with the clinical detachment of someone discussing quarterly financial reports, rather than life-and-death betrayals, which is how my father's people always knew exactly when and where to intercept our rescue convoys. The safe house suddenly feels like a stage set for a play I never auditioned for, where everyone knew their roles except me, and the federal protection I thought I was receiving was actually an elaborate method of keeping me under surveillance while using my recordings to map and destroy the very rescue operations I had unknowingly been helping to coordinate for 3 years. Martinez's face contorts with something between rage and desperation as Constantine produces a tablet displaying financial records that show regular deposits into offshore accounts linked to her identity. Payments that coincide perfectly with the dates when rescue operations were compromised, and the victims Constantine had been trying to save ended up back in the hands of their traffickers, creating a paper trail of corruption that explains why the FBI's efforts against human trafficking have been so systematically ineffective. My father's empire reaches into every level of government, every law enforcement agency, every judicial system that might pose a threat to his operations. Constantine continues, his voice carrying the weight of someone who has spent years fighting a war that most people don't even know exists. Which is why I had to become someone he trusted, someone who could access his networks from the inside, and slowly, carefully, redirect his resources toward their destruction, rather than their expansion. The revelation that Constantine has been playing a role for the better part of a decade, presenting himself as a loyal son, while secretly working to dismantle everything his father built, creates a cognitive shift that makes me question every interaction we've ever had, and wonder how much of what I interpreted as criminal coldness was actually the emotional armor necessary to maintain such a devastating long-term deception. As sirens wail in the distance, not FBI reinforcements, but Constantine's own cleanup crews arriving to remove evidence of tonight's confrontation before legitimate law enforcement can complicate the situation. He extends his hand toward me with the same gesture he used countless times when helping me out of cars or guiding me through crowded restaurants, except this time, the offer carries the weight of choosing between everything I thought I believed about justice and morality, and the possibility that truth is far more complex and dangerous than any federal training manual ever prepared me to understand. The choice is yours, Serafina, he says with the quiet intensity of someone offering salvation disguised as damnation. Stay with the people who have been using you to perpetuate the very crimes you thought you were fighting, or help me finish what we started together, even if neither of us understood what we were really doing until tonight. The sound of Martinez's weapon clattering to the floor as she finally succumbs to blood loss creates a moment of absolute silence that feels pregnant with possibilities. And I realize that whatever decision I make in the next few seconds will determine not only whether I live or die, but whether the rescue operations that have saved hundreds of innocent lives will continue, or whether they'll be systematically destroyed by the very federal agencies that are supposed to protect the vulnerable, leaving countless victims to disappear into a nightmare that exists just beyond the edges of civilized society's willingness to acknowledge its existence. Standing in the ruins of what was supposed to be my salvation, surrounded by the shattered glass and broken promises of federal protection that proved as fragile as everything else I once believed about justice and morality, I find myself staring into Constantine's ice-blue eyes and seeing not the monster I convinced myself he was, but rather a man who has spent years carrying the unbearable weight of fighting evil with the very tools and resources that evil provided, creating a moral complexity that makes my black and white understanding of right and wrong seem as naive as a child's fairy tale about heroes and villains. The blood on his hands, which I now understand came from protecting the innocent rather than destroying them, gleams in the emergency lighting like stigmata marking him as someone who has chosen to sacrifice his own soul in service of saving others, and the realization that I have been working against him, rather than with him, for the past 3 months, feels like discovering that I've been standing on the wrong side of a war I never understood was being fought. Agent Martinez's labored breathing creates a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant sirens as she struggles to maintain consciousness, her face pale with blood loss, and what I now recognize as the dawning comprehension that her carefully constructed web of corruption has finally collapsed around her, leaving her exposed as someone who sold innocent lives for money, while hiding behind the badge and authority that should have protected those same victims from the horrors she helped perpetuate. The financial records on Constantine's tablet tell a story of systematic betrayal that spans years of compromised operations, and as I watch the light fading from her eyes, I feel no satisfaction or vindication, only a profound sadness for how completely I was manipulated by someone I trusted to represent the moral clarity I thought I was fighting for. "The container's arriving at dawn," Constantine says, his voice carrying an urgency that I now understand has nothing to do with criminal enterprise, and everything to do with 23 young women who will disappear forever if we don't reach them before his father's people realize that tonight's operation has blown their entire network wide open. They're not cargo to be sold. They're victims we've been tracking for 8 months, and this is our only chance to get them out before the trafficking ring relocates them to South America, where we'll never find them again. The weight of their lives settles on my shoulders like a mantle I never asked to wear, but can no longer refuse, and I realize that whatever choice I make in this moment will echo through the lives of people whose names I'll never know, but whose freedom depends on decisions made in this blood-soaked safe house by someone who until tonight thought she understood the difference between salvation and damnation. As Constantine's cleanup crew moves through the building with the efficient professionalism of people who have spent years erasing evidence of shadow wars that official channels refuse to acknowledge, I find myself thinking about all those late nights in his office when I felt the electric tension between us, but attributed it to simple attraction rather than recognizing it as the connection between two people who were unknowingly working toward the same goal from opposite directions. Our mutual deception, creating a foundation of lies that somehow supported something resembling truth. The irony that our greatest moment of honesty comes surrounded by destruction and betrayal feels like a metaphor for everything about this life I've stumbled into, where moral certainty is a luxury that people like us can't afford, and love grows in the spaces between right and wrong, like flowers blooming in a graveyard. I've been fighting this war alone for so long that I almost forgot what it felt like to have someone I could trust, he continues, his hand still extended toward me like a bridge across the chasm that separates my old life from whatever comes next. And the vulnerability in his admission strips away the last vestiges of the controlled criminal mastermind persona to reveal someone who has been desperately lonely in ways that money and power can never address. The choice he's offering isn't just between competing versions of justice, but between the safety of ignorance and the dangerous intimacy of shared purpose, between the comfortable lies that let me sleep at night and the complicated truths that will probably keep me awake for the rest of my life, however long or short that might be. Outside, the sound of his father's enforcers approaching creates a deadline that transforms this moment from philosophical contemplation into immediate survival. And I realize that whatever romantic fantasies I once harbored about Constantine pale in comparison to the reality of a man who would risk everything to save strangers simply because it's the right thing to do, even when doing right requires methods that official channels would never sanction and moral compromises that most people would never make. The sirens grow closer, but instead of bringing rescue, they herald the arrival of corrupt officials who will ensure that tonight's truth gets buried under layers of paperwork and jurisdictional confusion, leaving the real criminals free to rebuild their networks, while the people trying to fight them disappear into witness protection or unmarked graves. Taking his outstretched hand feels like stepping off a cliff into free fall, except instead of plummeting toward destruction, I find myself suspended between one version of myself and another, between Serafina Chen, who filed papers and answered phones and believed in simple moral equations, and someone I don't have a name for yet, who understands that sometimes love means choosing to stand with someone whose methods you question, but whose heart you finally recognize as fundamentally aligned with your own. The warmth of his fingers closing around mine creates a circuit that completes something I didn't know was broken. And as we move together through the wreckage of my former certainties toward whatever waits beyond the safe house doors, I realize that this isn't an ending, but a beginning. Not the conclusion of my story, but the first page of a new chapter written in a language I'm still learning to speak. As we disappear into the night together, leaving behind the comfortable illusions of federal protection and moral simplicity, I understand that some betrayals are actually forms of salvation in disguise, and that the most profound transformations often begin in moments when everything we thought we knew about ourselves and the world crumbles away, leaving only the choice between who we were and who we might become if we're brave enough to step into the darkness, holding hands with someone whose own journey through the shadows has taught them that sometimes the only way to find the light is to embrace the complicated truth that heroes and villains are often the same people viewed from different angles, and that love, when it's real, grows strongest in the spaces where moral certainty ends and human connection begins. The morning sun streams through the bulletproof windows of our new safe house in Montenegro, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors that Constantine insisted on installing, because he remembered me mentioning once, during one of our late-night conversations in his old office, that I had always dreamed of living somewhere with real wood instead of the sterile corporate carpeting that defined my former existence. And as I watch him coordinate rescue operations from behind a desk that looks remarkably similar to the one where I first fell in love with a man I thought was a monster, I realize that some transformations are so complete that they render our previous selves unrecognizable even to ourselves. The 23 women we saved, that dawned 6 months ago, have become the foundation of something larger than either of us imagined possible. A network of survivors who now help us identify and extract other victims, creating an exponentially expanding circle of salvation that grows stronger with each successful operation, and each life reclaimed from the darkness that once seemed impossible to escape. Martinez's corruption trial dominated headlines for 3 weeks before the media moved on to newer scandals. But the ripple effects of her exposure continue to reverberate through federal law enforcement agencies as investigators discover the true extent of how deeply trafficking money had penetrated supposedly incorruptible institutions. And watching corrupt officials fall like dominoes from our secure location feels like watching divine justice unfold in real time. Even though I know our own methods exist in moral gray areas that would make my former self deeply uncomfortable if she could see what I've become. The woman I was 6 months ago, who believed in clear lines between right and wrong and trusted that government agencies existed to protect the innocent, would probably view the woman I am now as someone who has been seduced by a charismatic criminal into abandoning everything she once held sacred. But that naive version of myself never understood that sometimes salvation requires getting your hands dirty in ways that official channels can never acknowledge or sanctify. Constantine has changed too, in ways both subtle and profound, as if having someone who knows the complete truth about his double life has lifted a weight from his shoulders that he carried for so long he forgot it was there. And the man who once needed to maintain the facade of cold criminality, even in private moments, now allows himself expressions of tenderness and vulnerability that make me understand how deeply the isolation of his undercover existence had wounded him. Our relationship exists in a space that defies easy categorization. We are partners in a shadow war against evil, lovers who found each other across the wreckage of our former lives, co-conspirators in operations that save lives through methods that would horrify conventional morality, and companions who understand that the love we share is inseparable from the dangerous work that brought us together and continues to define our shared existence. The house itself serves as both sanctuary and command center, its reinforced walls hiding computer servers that track trafficking routes across 3 continents, while its seemingly ordinary facade conceals enough firepower to outfit a small army and sophisticated communication equipment that allows us to coordinate with extraction teams from Bosnia to Bangkok without ever appearing on any government surveillance network. Living here feels like existing in a parallel universe where the normal rules of society don't apply, and every day brings new challenges that test not only our operational security, but our emotional resilience as we process the constant exposure to humanity's capacity for both unspeakable cruelty and extraordinary heroism, often embodied in the same person, depending on the circumstances they face and the choices they make when confronted with impossible situations. The irony that I now live the life I once dreamed of, waking up next to someone I love, doing work that feels meaningful, existing in a space that feels like home rather than just a place to sleep, except that this dream life exists entirely outside the boundaries of legal society and depends for its continuation on our ability to remain invisible to both law enforcement and criminal organizations that would destroy us if they understood the true scope of what we've built together. My mornings begin with intelligence briefings that detail new trafficking routes and potential rescue opportunities. Afternoons involve coordinating with safe house operators and extraction specialists whose identities I know only through encrypted communications. And evenings often find us planning operations that will either save dozens of innocent lives or result in our own deaths, if even the smallest detail goes wrong. But perhaps the most profound change is in how I understand love itself, because what Constantine and I share transcends the romantic fantasies I once entertained about passionate but ultimately safe relationships with men whose greatest risk was emotional unavailability, rather than the constant possibility of violent death. And instead, we have built something that exists in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments of absolute trust required when your life depends on your partner's competence and split-second decision-making, in the intimacy that comes from seeing someone make choices that reveal the fundamental essence of their character, when all social pretenses have been stripped away by circumstances that demand nothing less than complete authenticity. Our love story is written in rescue operations successfully completed, in victims safely delivered to new lives, in corrupt officials exposed and brought to justice, in the gradual dismantling of networks that have destroyed countless innocent lives, and in the quiet moments between crises when we lie together in the darkness and try to process the weight of what we've seen and done in service of something larger than ourselves. The financial cost of maintaining this operation runs into millions of dollars annually, money that flows from the same criminal enterprises we're systematically destroying, creating a moral paradox that would have paralyzed my former self, but now seems like simple poetic justice, using the profits of evil to fund its own destruction while building something beautiful and life-affirming from the ashes of institutions that failed to protect the people they were supposed to serve. Constantine's business acumen, freed from the necessity of maintaining criminal appearances, has proven remarkably effective at generating legitimate income streams that help fund our operations while creating plausible cover identities that allow us to move through normal society when operational requirements demand it. And sometimes I catch glimpses of who he might have been in a different world, one where his father's crimes hadn't forced him to choose between complicity and the kind of resistance that requires sacrificing any possibility of a conventional life. The rescued women and children whose lives we've helped rebuild serve as constant reminders of why this work matters more than personal safety or social acceptability. And their letters and updates provide emotional sustenance during the dark periods when the enormity of human trafficking seems too vast and entrenched to meaningfully impact through our individual efforts, no matter how sophisticated our operations become, or how many resources we can marshal against forces that seem to regenerate faster than we can destroy them. Some of these survivors have chosen to join our network as intelligence gatherers and safe house operators, creating a community of people who understand that conventional society failed them so completely that they must build alternative systems of protection and justice using whatever tools they can access, legal or otherwise, sanctioned or forbidden by authorities who proved themselves either complicit or ineffective when their protection was most desperately needed. As I write these words in my journal, the same leather-bound book that Constantine gave me for my birthday last month, with an inscription that simply says, "For the woman who chose truth over safety," I can hear him in the next room coordinating tonight's extraction of 16 teenagers from a trafficking ring that operates under the protection of 3 different police departments. And I realize that this life we've built together represents a form of love that exists nowhere in romantic literature or relationship advice columns. Love that manifests not through conventional gestures of affection, but through the willingness to risk everything in service of principles that matter more than personal happiness. Love that grows stronger under pressure rather than weaker. Love that finds its deepest expression in shared purpose rather than shared pleasure. Though we have discovered that the two are not mutually exclusive when you find someone whose moral compass points in exactly the same direction as your own, even when that direction leads through territory that official maps refuse to acknowledge exists. Tonight, as every night, we will go to sleep knowing that tomorrow might bring our deaths, or our exposure, or the collapse of everything we've worked to build, but also knowing that the work itself has already justified whatever sacrifices it requires, and whatever prices we ultimately pay for choosing to stand against forces that most people prefer to pretend don't exist. And in that knowledge, I find a peace that my former self, despite her comfortable certainties and social respectability, never achieved in all her years of following rules that were designed to maintain systems rather than challenge them, to preserve comfort rather than pursue justice, to prioritize safety over truth in ways that ultimately served neither safety nor truth, but only the illusion that evil can be contained through proper procedures and institutional oversight, rather than confronted directly by people willing to abandon everything they thought they knew about how the world works in favor of everything they discover about how it could work. If enough people chose courage over comfort and truth over convenience, regardless of the personal cost such choices inevitably demand.